Welcome to the second presentation of Climate Change and Social Change. I'm Wilson Dickinson. In this presentation, I want to consider the timelines and timescales of working for social change in the face of climate change. In relation to time, climate change presents us with a number of challenges. It can be hard to conceive of as a threat because its destruction typically happens so slowly and imperceptibly. Rob Nixon has named this dynamic slow violence. Whereas we're accustomed to tuning into the news and hearing stories of sensationalized violence, in which lives are destroyed in a matter of moments by a lone gunman, by a police shooting, by war, or by so-called natural disaster, the destruction of climate change and environmental degradation is not typically accompanied by pyrotechnic explosions and single actors. Rather, climate change is a horror story that unfolds as billions of small acts invisibly accumulate and lead to warming waters, melting ice, and shifting weather patterns, which throw fragile balances off and lead to droughts, desertification, wildfires, floods, and which contribute to ecosystem collapse, famine, and eventually all of this trickles out into the intensification of poverty, political destabilization, mass migrations, and deep conflict, and so on. Yet, because everything is happening on such a wide scale and so slowly, it can be hard to follow the plot. The slow unfolding of climate change also makes it difficult to even bear to watch, much less respond, as we are living in the midst of a catastrophe that is unfolding in slow motion. These problems are rooted in political and economic structures that exist on a global scale, and they have produced issues in planet-wide systems. Perhaps the greatest challenge in responding to climate change is trying to live both with a sense of urgency and an abiding prophetic patience and courage that understands how long deep change will take. And this is what I want to consider in this presentation: how our efforts can operate on multiple timelines, both so that we can work for system change and so that we can sustain this work over the coming decades. So first, the urgency. Again, the scope and speed of climate change make it somewhat easy to avoid in our individualized and fast-paced culture. But there is nothing more urgent to address. The summer of 2019, the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, the central measure of climate change, reached an 800,000 year high at 415 parts per million. So this number shattered the levels that have been experienced during the existence of Homo sapiens. Humans have never lived on an Earth like this. And because the Earth is like a giant pot of water we just placed on the stove, it's going to take a while to see what this looks like. But to give us a hint, the last time that there was this much carbon in the atmosphere, there were trees growing at the South Pole. Now, in theory, there are things that we could do to begin to draw down this carbon. Every year, carbon rises and falls as much of the vegetation of Earth goes through its life cycle. But we are nowhere near being on track to begin to draw down. Right now, as a planet, we are on track to exponentially add carbon to the atmosphere. And at our current pace, global temperatures will rise between 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which will lead to a profound acceleration of all the problems mentioned earlier, and which will likely lead to enormous political instability and violent conflict. So the climate agreement reached in Paris a few years ago, which Trump withdrew from, set the goal of a 2-degree increase in temperature by century's end. So the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which collates and aggregates all the research on climate change and tries to show a big picture, and which errs on the side of being guarded to conservative in their estimates, proposed that to avoid many of the worst case scenarios, we need to limit the change in temperature to a 1.5 degree Celsius increase by century's end. So we've already reached a 1 degree increase. So they warn that the difference between their recommended 1.5 and the current goal of the Paris Agreement, which has been withdrawn from, which is a 2 degree increase, that difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees could be catastrophic. That increase of 0.5 degree brings both the guaranteed intensification of issues that will lead to the sufferings of an unthinkable number of people, and it also increases the risk of hitting certain tipping points, which would produce feedback loops that trigger warming beyond our control. So this has led the IPCC and many other scientific and activist groups in the fall of 2018 to issue warnings that we have about a decade to address climate change. That is our window for keeping within the 1.5-degree increase, an increase that will still come with immense challenges and suffering. But to get there, we'll have to bring wide-scale change in the next 10 years. So the urgency is real. Yet, the urgency and the anxiety should not stop us from seeking system change and engaging in long-term work to bring it about. Yes, we need to engage in action that can effectuate change soon. But if what is required is building something deep, sustainable, sustaining, and just, we cannot afford to wait any longer to get that process started. As the Chinese proverb goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And we need to both be literally and figuratively planting trees. Now, the approach I sketched last time, the environmental justice approach, demands that we think on a number of timelines. So first, in terms of the next decade. Because for the next decade, we need to do everything we can to organize and mobilize for political and economic change. The IPCC is right to promote a sense of urgency. We need to, and we need to be ready for a political revolution. We are living in a period where profound change and social movements seem possible, and we should be open to the possibility that collective power might emerge sooner than we expect. But when working on the timeline of the next decade, we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. For the next decade, we need to work for drawdown and be open to mitigation and compromise if we must. The stakes are too high not to push for real change and fight for everything we can get. But at the same time, we need to keep a longer timeline in mind. And so we also need to be thinking of, too, the timeline of the next several decades. A civilization-level transition is coming, whether it be a preventative response to climate change or reaction to the catastrophes and collapses it brings with it. The world does not end if we don't win the next decade. The problems just get radically and traumatically worse. So regardless of what happens, we need to be working to build the people power to help make the transition positive rather than dystopic. One of the big questions is, will the transition be guided by justice, simplicity, solidarity, and peace, or inequality, exploitation, oppression, and war? Right now, most political and economic structure seems to be driven by money power. To oppose those interests, we will need people power. To build that collective power, we will need to engage in varied local work, like building communities, creating alternative economies and institutions, like food economies and cooperatives, transforming old organizations and structures, like churches and neighborhoods, and building coalitions between groups by finding ways to work with and across difference, rather than assuming that we all have to belong to the same group to work together. Now, this kind of work takes time to develop, but it is the roots that will make grassroots power both possible and worthwhile. So finally, 3, we need to be working on the timeline of the next century so that we can build something much of which we will never see come to fruition. To stick with the proverb of planting the tree, we're not just looking to grow a few trees in our backyard for the next decade. We're not looking to add to the trees in our neighborhood of the next several years or decades. We are looking to restore the forests of the earth. Our work should be driven by visions of hope, of a better world and a better life, of communities that are just, joyful, beautiful, and loving. Now, all of these timelines are urgent. And all of them require our time now. And we need to be involved in political processes, and we need to be involved in changing our places and lives. These efforts are not at odds with one another. Our political work can connect us to others and bring clarity to our lives and reshape our hearts, which have been formed by individualism, consumerism, and neoliberalism. Our local work can build the people power, intimate knowledge, and sustaining spirit that will lead to change in political spheres. For both, our deep hope for a better future will guide us. And yet, not all of us can be involved in all of this work at the same time or in the same way. In the next presentation, I'll talk about how our places, memberships, and gifts will guide us in thinking about our role in these vast movements. In this presentation, I want to think about these different timescales of change, drawing upon the characterization of the sources from last time, as the reality of climate change is rooted in structures of power and ways of life. By looking at structures of power, we begin to see issues and timescales that are much longer than the 24-hour news cycle, the financial quarter, the yearly budget, and the election cycle. By considering ways of life, our attention will be drawn away from the spectacular and the newsworthy to the time of the everyday and the quotidian. So while I want to affirm the urgency of the next decade, I want to pump the brakes on some of the activist interpretation of the IPCC's warning about our window to address climate change. Again, the world does not end if we do not reach our goal over the next 10 years. The reality we face will be horrible, horrible. But declarations about the game being over in 10 years are probably a bit too rosy on how things are and have been. In white environmentalism, there is a deep and profound romantic streak in how we view nature, the past, and human activity. Along these lines, there is often a tendency to see things as being pure, perfect, pristine, and virginal, or seeing things as despoiled and ruined. A lot of work in mainstream white environmentalism ends up seeing the world in terms of the virgin or the whore. Either there is a pure wilderness which we can experience as individuals out in the park, or there are natural resources which we can do with as we please. And so the loss of our pristine past seems like the loss of a virginal innocence that can never be reclaimed. Yet, if we see the sources of climate change in terms of power structures, the past does not look so virginal. A number of scholars and historians have done very convincing work to root the problems we currently face in long-standing historical trajectories. For example, the efforts of colonialism set up massive structures that denuded the earth of much of its trees. They put into place economies of extraction that degraded the land and were built on the backs of slaves. The processes of colonialism destroyed countless sustainable agrarian cultures and replaced them with imperial economic structures that reached around the globe. Others trace the roots of climate change to processes of industrialization, in which these global economies were ramped up to the burning of fossil fuels and even greater oppression, extraction, and degradation. Still others propose that climate emissions really came to a head in the post-World War boom of the 50s that solidified consumerism. Most pressing in our context was the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s, begun by Reagan and Thatcher but championed by Bill Clinton and his successors. This process spread the structures of finance-dominated capitalism around the world and brought about the perfect storm of both an exponentially growing economy that drove an exponentially growing carbon emissions, while at the same time the movement of neoliberalism actively and tirelessly worked to destroy the structures of collective action that opposed the logic of the market. At the very time when the earth needed to respond to a common problem by protecting the commonwealth with simplicity and justice, neoliberalism privatized the commonwealth, sold it to the highest bidder, and set it on fire. Now, taking this longer view of the issue helps us to see that we are not losing a virginal world where everyone was happy, and that we need to work to simply sustain things as they are. Rather, seeing the way that systems of oppression and extraction have led to immense suffering and to climate change helps us to understand both that we need to be working for system change and that these problems are rooted in processes, structures, and architectures that are decades and even centuries old, and therefore it will take time and collective action to transform them. Furthermore, by seeing the problem in these longer timescales, we can come to view our current systems from the perspective of what Johannes Metz calls dangerous memory. So whereas the culture that we are raised in and live in directs our attention to the goodness and virtue of the progress of the systems in which we live, we need to awaken the dangerous memory of the underside of enlightened reason.
Our hearts are shaped by the propaganda of the victors that makes us think about the strength and genius of colonial and globalized cultures. And so we tend to look past structures of power and put our hopes in the progress of technology or the cure-all of the market growth, or of market growth. Instead, we must attend to the dangerous memories of the vanquished and oppressed. We are not losing a virginal past. Rather, we have inherited a world and a people traumatized by the past. But facing this past is not about feeling guilt. It's about clarifying our vision so that we understand the nature of the problem and so that we can discern the path to move forward in solidarity, justice, and joy. We need to face this suffering to see that the system that we are losing is not beautiful or virtuous, but that it has a deeply monstrous side. And we also need to see that others have and will continue to suffer in unspeakable ways if we simply transition and sustain this system. Climate change does not mean the end of something, but the continuation and profound and unthinkable intensification of many terrible things. Now, to change systems this massive and deeply to change systems that are this massive and deeply rooted will take time. But, and this is important, in saying that it will take a long time does not mean that we need to follow the path of pragmatic incrementalism. Too often we think of change as having two options: quick, massive, and abrupt revolution, or an incrementalism that works within and accepts the values and procedures of the current system. A third option to both of these is movement building, rooted in cultural and community building. Now, one helpful way to think about the long work of system change is captured in the two loops diagram of change. I'm taking my account of this story from Matthew Williams, who is currently the president of the Interdenominational Theological Center. Though this picture is not his and it's taken off the web. So, the model of two loops represents the cycles that systems move in. Like organisms, systems and institutions move through life cycles. The top loop represents a dominant system which emerges into prevalence, hits its peak, declines, and dies. The bottom loop represents an alternative system that emerges during the dominant system's lifespan and largely exists underground until it emerges into widespread influence. Now, we might imagine the system of fossil fuel economies. At a certain point, the system reaches peak oil. At this peak, a certain kind of decline begins to set in. But this decline is not necessarily short, but perhaps is very, very long. And during this decline, there's often not an acknowledgement that something else is needed, but every effort is made to maintain power. Now, during this decline, alternative forms of energy are being organized. It often takes a long time for these systems to emerge. Now, typically, what is visible to most people is the dominant and established system, or the top loop. For many stages of development, new systems are largely invisible. They might start with small pockets of people, cultivating new forms of community or practice, and then people start to form networks to learn from each other. And out of these networks might form communities of practice, where groups are really figuring out how to do things in a different way. But through this whole process, these alternatives are still largely out of sight and not even understood by most people. It's only after these communities of practice coalesce that the story of these alternatives might become more and more widespread. Just as dominant systems might go through processes of life and death, new systems go through long processes of growth and maturation. Now, what I think this diagram might help us to see, or at least imagine, is that we can engage in long-term work that builds a movement that takes time to come together. And so we're not left to pray for a revolution or work within dying systems and labor under their values and processes. But a lot of our work is about building communities, cultivating networks, deepening our practices, and telling the story of these alternatives. Now, we don't often see these longer timelines because in thinking about change, we're so focused on the immediate election cycle. But movements take time to build, and beyond the immediate results of an election, there is the long work of building communities, culture, coalitions, infrastructures, and alternatives. Now, these movements do have an impact on electoral processes. For example, most of the story of Republican power in the United States from the last several decades is about money power. But part of this story is the movement building of white evangelical and conservative Christians. A big part of our work is to broaden our political engagement to include mobilizing for voting and protest, and the work of changing our ways of life and social infrastructures, which is what I want to turn to next. So our focus on the obvious centers of power, a focus that is constantly reinforced by the media, trains our attention upon the spectacular and the exceptional. But lost in these rhythms of power that is hiding in plain sight, surrounding us is the practices, norms, structures, and infrastructures of our everyday work, home, and social lives. There's no doubt that what happens with climate treaties, or in boardrooms is of central importance. And if we cannot collectively place pressure upon leaders and experts in these domains, we will be working in vain. But one of the ways that we can build collective power is to build models, cultivate communities, and develop practices that will make a different kind of life and a different rhythm of life possible. Again, the traditions and wisdom of environmental justice are helpful here, as they do not define nature as something that is far off, that is out in the wilderness, but environmental justice movements define the environment as where we work, live, and play. And so the habitats that need to be healed and transformed are not just those that are beyond the city, but we need to transform the habitats where we live, because they are, in many ways, the source of so much of this consumption and destruction. Now, efforts to make such change, however, quickly run against some obstacles, many of which have to do with time. People simply don't have the time to creatively engage in this work of social transformation. This is because the way of neoliberalism organizes time is at odds with simplicity, collaboration, joy, and peace. Right? So neoliberalism organizes our time in terms of a frantic work week, where one not only works long hours, but the architecture of our communities demands more time in commutes, and electronic forms of communication colonize our time outside of work. Our view of the future is also shortened as we are trained to look at the financial quarter or the budget year. Most centrally, our time is constantly framed and trained by the values of efficiency and productivity. These central values of neoliberalism organize and shape our relationships to time as we become more focused on achieving measurable goals that add to our value. Now, this rhythm of life leads to an ethos of busyness in which it becomes difficult to stop, rest, and reflect. Instead, busyness becomes a badge of honor in and of itself, and the presence of people who are not matching the busy person is in both their display of virtuous activity and in their reality of burdensome labor are viewed with a certain degree of resentment. I find that when I'm in the midst of a frantic season of work, that I often lose the capacity to slow down. It's not just that I don't have time to rest. It is that when I do have a window for rest, I am not able to truly do so. It's as though I need a period of cessation, of slowing down, before I can get to a space where I can experience a different rhythm that allows me to feel joy and peace and really reflect and contemplate. Now, Christian traditions and communities could serve as a gateway into a different experience of time, which would cultivate within people and in their relationships and lives the capacity for a different way. For example, an experience of deep Sabbath could help people find breathing room, not to refuel for their frantic lives, but it could serve as a reorienting center that could provide an alternative rule of life. Sabbath is both about stillness and right relationship with which leads to justice. Churches and Christian communities have the opportunity and even responsibility to help people find a different orienting rhythm to their daily lives. Rather than being focused on the budget year, they can feel connected to intergenerational memory, feeling a sense of connection to a place, and carrying the dangerous memory of the injustices that our current order is built upon. Ancient and prophetic wisdom can help us see in wider timescales. These spaces can allow us to give voice to these traumas in both laments and in acts of solidarity. Sabbath practices of joy, other Christian practices of joy can help us live into a rhythm of life beyond our busyness. Instead of living by the values of productivity and efficiency, we can organize our time around acts of care and love, which are literally excluded from metrics like the GDP and basic budgets. Our time can be focused on practices and relationships of joy, blessing, stillness, and peace. We can learn in this space how to re-enter our lives and be agents of the kingdom seeking to bring change, rather than serving as chaplains of empire who are empowering and triaging for the status quo. Now, the work of Sabbath cannot be limited to Sunday or the church building. It instead must be taken home, to work, and to the market. But we might also find places to build these capacities for change in third spaces. A place like a community garden makes these contrasting rhythms of life clear. The time of the garden is totally offbeat from the full schedule and the to-do list. The garden grows at its own pace. The weather rains on our plans. And while all of this usually makes the project of a new community garden short-lived, if we look at the garden as a school, however, we can see it as a place to slow our anxious hearts and to realize our connection to and dependence upon a place. Seen in the timeline of the work week or the election cycle, the garden is a silly indulgence. But if we see this third space as a training center for a movement that is seeking to cultivate grassroots power and nurture just and joyful communities, then we can see that the time for planting this proverbial and literal tree is now. The urgency of climate change is real. And in the next 10 years, we will need to push for radical and, quite frankly, any change we can get. But if what we want is not simply to sustain our current unjust and alienating systems, we need to engage in the long work of system and social change. This will require dangerous memories to keep these structures in view, and it will require the prophetic, patient, and courageous work of transforming our lives and places. As Garo Perovitz says, if we're seriously interested in transforming the most powerful system in the world, if we want to play this game, then chips are decades of your life. If you want to play, you need to throw in a few decades of your life on the table. Now, while such a proposition might sound sacrificial, the reality is that this is the good news. It's only by losing our overfull work weeks and anxious and alienated lives that we will save our collective lives, so that we may live into beautiful and just communities and places.